The chamber was supposed to be ordinary that night, routine votes, tired speeches echoing off marble walls, but it wasn't. The moment Lauren Boebert seized the microphone, the atmosphere shifted like a storm front rolling in. Her voice sliced through the chamber, sharp with disdain, dripping with the kind of arrogance that every immigrant, every working family knows too well when power sneers down at them. She leaned into her words with a smirk that seemed rehearsed for cameras, tossing out a barb so cutting that even the stenographer paused his typing. The insult wasn't just aimed at policy, it was aimed at identity itself, dismissing millions of Americans in one violent swipe of language. A hush fell, then murmurs, gasps, a wave of disbelief that roared past the chamber walls. Phones lit. Up instantly, fingers raced across screens, breaking news chyrons readying themselves in newsrooms across the country. This wasn't politics as usual. This was a moment designed to humiliate, to strip dignity away in full view, and for a second it looked like she had succeeded. But then, movement. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez straightened in her seat, lock-eyed, unflinching. Jasmine Crockett, equally fierce, leaned forward with the fire of someone who refused to let history be rewritten by bullies disguised as lawmakers. No stage directions, no whispers, just a shared look between two women who understood what was really at stake. This wasn't just about clapping back. It was about standing in the gap for every community that had been told to go back where they came from. Chaos crackled like static electricity. Every eye turned, waiting. Would these two rise? Would they let the sneer hang unchallenged, let the insult become another notch in an endless cycle of performative cruelty? For a heartbeat, the chamber held its breath, Congress itself frozen in the tension of the moment. And then, from the corner of the room, came the kind of composure that villains never prepare for. Neither AOC nor Crockett lunged at the bait. They didn't shout. They didn't flinch. They radiated the kind of calm strength that makes arrogance nervous, that makes the powerful stumble over their own bravado. The silence was heavy, but it was the kind of silence before impact, before a tidal wave comes crashing. What happened next would spark hashtags, ignite debates, and rattle not just the Capitol but the entire country. Because this was no longer about a petty insult on the House floor. This was about what happens when truth finally decides to speak. This was not the first time the chamber had echoed with careless words. Congress has seen insults, grandstanding, and inflammatory rhetoric countless times before, but for many watching, this one cut differently. It wasn't merely policy disagreement. It was identity degradation at the highest seat of American democracy. The air in the room wasn't filled with just political theater. It was filled with the unmistakable perfume of contempt aimed at people whose very existence challenges old hierarchies of power. Lauren Boebert's words weren't isolated. They were the latest chapter in a long tradition of politicians using immigrant communities, women of color, and progressives as their foils to rile up their base. Every syllable dripped with the practiced venom of someone who understands the formula. Insult, provoke, then bask in the headlines. But what Boebert never anticipates is what happens when the target refuses to play her game. When the villains she tries to paint instead emerge as the heroes of the night. America has always been built on these collisions. On one side, those who cling to a narrow vision of who belongs, wielding mockery as their weapon. On the other, voices who embody the complex, defiant, unshakable truth that belonging is not hers to grant or deny. And in that House chamber, AOC and Jasmine Crockett represented exactly that. They didn't just sit there as individuals. They sat draped in generations of struggle and hope, carrying the unspoken stories of families who worked 2 jobs, marched in the streets, or crossed borders believing this country would welcome them. That's why the entire room felt the tension, ripple. Viewers at home didn't just hear words hurled into the record. They felt their own lives brushed, their own identity prodded. Millions of daughters, mothers, and young progressives scrolling on their phones recognize the insult not as abstract political points, but as a familiar punch to the gut, an insult to them, to their families, to their communities. And here is where the stakes rose beyond theater, because the hero-villain dynamic wasn't just about three women trading barbs on the floor. This was about the soul of representation in America. AOC and Crockett stood at the intersection of old power colliding with the new face of American leadership. Unapologetically diverse, unapologetically bold, and unwilling to shrink in the face of taunts. Their decision to respond, or not, would speak louder than any headline. Was Congress going to remain the stage where cruelty reigns unchecked, or was this night going to tilt the narrative toward dignity, truth, and courage? Those watching on live feeds leaned in. Journalists scribbled half-finished sentences, waiting to see if the story turned into a viral showdown or fizzled as just another skirmish in a divided Capitol. In the gallery above, visitors whispered to each other, sensing history crouched on the edge of unfolding. Some members shifted nervously in their seats. Others smiled, knowing the cameras were catching every twitch, every gesture. Politics isn't just about laws, it's about perception. And in that moment, the perception was clear. Two women, standing for more than themselves, about to push back against a narrative designed to erase them. This wasn't just another gotcha soundbite waiting to happen. It was the chance for a seismic reversal. The choice AOC and Crockett faced was simple but monumental. Tolerate the insult and let its venom seep into the record, or defy it with a response sharp enough to echo into the future. And that, right there, is why every screen suddenly went from casual viewing to rapt attention, because everyone could feel it. The very next word spoken would not just clap back at a heckler. They would create a moment replayed on timelines, captioned in memes, dissected by commentators, and remembered by history. What happened next wouldn't just raise eyebrows, it would change everything. Lauren Boebert did not step into the Capitol as a mystery. From the very beginning of her political career, she branded herself as the loudest voice in the room, proud of being brash, unfiltered, and impossible to ignore. For her supporters, this was charm, a real American standing up against Washington elites. For her critics, it was chaos personified, a human megaphone who wielded insults as policy and posturing as principle. But what defines a villain in history is rarely a single insult, it's a pattern. And Lauren Boebert's pattern is impossible to ignore. She rose on a wave of distrust, fueling her politics with grievances rather than solutions, with attacks rather than ideas. While her district struggled with jobs and infrastructure, she spent her time seeking out ever more inflammatory sound bites. The cameras became her currency, the outrage her oxygen. She knew that in today's America, silence doesn't trend. Theatrics do. And so every insult lobbed at immigrants, women of color, or anyone who deviated from her narrative wasn't spontaneous. It was strategic performance, designed to go viral. Her public persona thrives on contradiction. She calls herself a fighter for working people, yet votes against policies designed to ease healthcare costs, invest in jobs, or protect families caught in economic struggle. She champions family values, yet her own controversies have turned into tabloid staples across the nation. No matter the headline, she spins the chaos into fuel, presenting herself as the target of persecution rather than the author of division. Victimhood has become her armor, while arrogance remains her sword. And yet, beneath this cultivated swagger, there lies the sharpest foreshadowing of her downfall. She measures success only in noise, not in impact. The villainy here is not in ideology alone. It is in the stubborn refusal to rise above spectacle. Every time she approached the microphone, America braced itself for what would come next, not with anticipation of leadership, but of provocation. Her legacy has become less about lawmaking and more about viral clips. This contradiction is exactly why her attack that night landed so differently. The words weren't shocking because they were unexpected. They were shocking because they were so expected. People have grown weary of the same act, the same venom, the same reduction of democracy into reality television. Yet, perversely, Boebert counts on that. She counts on her opponents losing patience and snapping in anger, because that's the clip she needs. Her rivals red-faced while she smirks in defiance. It's a formula of bait and spectacle. And on this night she believed it would work again. But arrogance blinds. What Boebert didn't foresee was the particular steeliness of her targets. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who thrives under pressure, and Jasmine Crockett, whose courtroom-trained precision makes her one of the sharpest voices in Congress. Boebert looked across the chamber and saw props for her performance, not protagonists whose own stories were far more compelling than her theatrics. That was her mistake. Villains often underestimate the patience and resilience of their opponents. The contradictions in her character tell a story bigger than one night. She insists she fights for freedom, yet her rhetoric often seeks to limit who is allowed to belong. She frames herself as protector of tradition, yet her behavior often undermines the very dignity of the office she holds. And while she thrives on blasting others for supposed hypocrisy, her own record, on votes, on integrity, on consistency, paints a picture of a politician who confuses defiance with leadership. But arrogance rarely lasts forever. The louder one grows, the more the gaps show. Every insult becomes less potent, every smirk more hollow, every performance harder to sustain. Eventually, audiences at home begin to recognize the act not as courage, but as cruelty in costume. And cruelty, history shows, always collapses under the weight of its own emptiness. So, in that chamber, when Boebert launched her insult into the air, she likely thought it would play out as usual. Outrage online, trending hashtags, her name back, in lights. What she did not expect was how decisively AOC and Jasmine Crockett would flip the script. Her pattern blinded her to the possibility that this night, this insult, would be the one that exposed the fragility behind the facade. Because when arrogance meets dignity, dignity eventually wins. When cruelty squares off against integrity, cruelty always reveals its own smallness. And that night, for all the cameras she sought, the image that would endure wasn't hers. It was the faces of those who challenged her calmly, powerfully, and brilliantly. Every villain sets the stage for their own downfall, and Lauren Boebert's downfall on that night began the second she mistook the chamber as her playground instead of the people's house. The villainy that had propelled her into headlines for years was about to backfire spectacularly, in front of a nation eager for a different kind of politics. What unfolded afterward would etch itself into memory, not because of the insult itself, but because of the response. And it was here, in these contradictions and blind spots, that the seeds of her unraveling were already sown. The nation didn't yet know it, but the noise she unleashed would be matched and surpassed by voices she couldn't silence, voices that weren't there for performance, but for truth. And when those voices finally rose, the Capitol and the country watching would never forget what came next. To understand why the chamber froze that night, not in fear, but in anticipation, you have to understand who was sitting silently, waiting. Because Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Jasmine Crockett didn't arrive in Congress by accident or entitlement. They did not walk into this place because doors were opened for them. They pushed those doors open with the bruises of hard fights, with years of being underestimated, and with the kind of experience that made them immune to cheap shots. The insult aimed their way wasn't just arrogance, it was ignorance. Lauren Boebert had no idea who she was actually standing against. Take Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Before she ever walked into the halls of power, she walked behind the counter at a bar in the Bronx. She worked double shifts mixing drinks, scrubbing dishes, stretching every dollar to make ends meet. She wasn't born into politics. She was born into a working-class family that knew sacrifice was the only ticket forward. When her father passed away, she shouldered the grief that no child deserves so early and felt the weight of financial strain that millions of American families know all too well. In that crucible, she didn't dissolve, she crystallized. She saw a political system tilted against people like her family, and instead of accepting it, she decided to challenge it. She grabbed a clipboard, knocked on doors, and built a grassroots movement that stunned even the most seasoned political operatives. She walked into Congress not as someone who was supposed to win, but as someone who won because she refused to accept what was supposed to happen. That matters, because when Lauren Boebert sneers about who does or doesn't belong, AOC knows exactly what belonging means. She has lived the rejection, carried the immigrant narratives of her Puerto Rican heritage, and she has stood in the space where dignity feels precarious. And still, she claimed her seat. Now, placed beside her Jasmine Crockett, fierce, composed, and forged in fire. Before stepping into the political arena, she was a public defender. She walked into courtrooms where her clients were poor, forgotten, accused, and dismissed. She didn't argue from ivory towers. She argued in crowded rooms where people's futures depended on every word she spoke. She sharpened her skills as a lawyer against an unforgiving system that routinely stacked the odds. She didn't flinch. She became the shield for people who had none, standing eye to eye with prosecutors, tearing through inconsistencies, demanding justice in spaces where justice was often optional. And like AOC, her path wasn't designed by legacy families or political insiders. Crockett came from Texarkana, the daughter of working-class parents who taught her that grit and persistence are not negotiable character traits. They're survival tools. Her rise represented something larger than herself, a generation of Black women who refused to let their voices be drowned out, who refused to let stereotypes dictate the measure of their worth. Her every speech in the House carries the cadence of someone who has seen systems up close and refuses to let them continue unchallenged. These two women share no identical origin, yet their stories intersect at that essential word: struggle. The kind that politicians like Boebert have never truly faced, the kind that binds you eternally to the communities you represent. Their lives are testaments to those who work invisible jobs, care for invisible struggles, and live in America, constantly told to be grateful for crumbs. They embody the endless march of immigrants, workers, and marginalized voices who built the nation not with noise, but with sweat. And in that chamber, that history was sitting directly across from arrogance. What makes their story epic is not just survival, it's transformation. AOC didn't just come from hardship, she transformed hardship into a platform. Crockett didn't just practice law, she redefined what legal defense could sound like when powered by empathy and wit. When critics swarm them with stereotypes, too young, too angry, too radical, they carry their lived experiences like shields and dare anyone to ignore them. And that night, those shields were polished with years of fire. It's easy for villains like Boebert to sneer when they look across Congress and see opponents as abstractions, the left, progressives, the squad. But to dismiss Crockett and Ocasio-Cortez as mere labels is to misunderstand who they are. They arrive in that chamber not as caricatures, but as walking testaments to generations who insisted on being counted. They are proof that America is far greater and far more diverse than the small vision their detractors want to preserve. So when Boebert's insult cracked against the chamber walls, it didn't land on fragile figures. It landed on women who have been through the fire, who have already weathered harder storms than an insult on C-SPAN. In fact, that insult activated something powerful. It was personal, yes, but it was also universal. For AOC, it echoed every time she'd been told she was just a bartender, stay in your place. For Crockett, it rhymed with every moment she was underestimated in courtrooms because of her race, her gender, or her youth. They knew this script, they had lived it, and that was the mistake. Boebert thought she had written the narrative. But history had already written one for AOC and Crockett long before this night began. A story of resilience, grit, vision, and passion that made them uniquely qualified for this collision. They were not merely participants. They were protagonists bred for high-stakes confrontation. Their silence that night, the calm before the reckoning, wasn't hesitation. It was strategy. It was the knowing pause of people who've prepared their whole lives for moments when dignity is on trial. And soon enough, their response would not simply clap back for themselves. It would carry the weight of millions of voices that refuse to be silenced. The chamber didn't realize it yet, but the protagonists weren't just ready for battle. They'd been preparing for it long before they ever won an election, and what they were about to unleash would not only defend their communities, it would change how America saw the line between spectacle and substance forever. The air inside the chamber thickened in a way that no headline could fully capture. What began as a cutting remark was quickly mutating into a confrontation that pulled everyone into its orbit. Lauren Boebert, sensing the attention fixed squarely on her, leaned harder into the performance. She doubled down with the sly grin of someone convinced she had cornered the spotlight. Her voice rose an octave, sharper, every syllable packed with deliberate cruelty. She was no longer addressing policy. She was lashing at identities, at womanhood, at the audacity of someone like AOC and Crockett to even sit in those leather-backed chairs. With every insult, the chamber's temperature climbed. A few allies nodded with forced laughter, but most looked unsettled. Even among her colleagues there was awareness. This was not the usual sparring over budgets or motions. This was one member attempting to turn the House floor into a viral stage, burnishing her brand not by debating ideas but by ridiculing dignity itself, and then, across from her, the counterbalance. AOC leaned back, her face carefully neutral, betraying none of the fury Twitter users were already tweeting about in real time. Her posture carried a silent challenge. Say what you want. The more you speak, the more you reveal yourself. Jasmine Crockett, seated just rows away, arched one eyebrow with the kind of controlled precision honed in courtrooms, a gesture so subtle and yet so fiery that even C-SPAN's otherwise lifeless broadcast seemed to spike with tension. They didn't need to yell. They didn't need to interrupt. Their composure was the loudest rebuttal in the room, and Boebert noticed. Bullies rely on reaction. Without it, they grow louder, searching desperately for a crack. She jabbed with reminders of outsider roots, tested jabs about youth and inexperience, lines rehearsed for pundits already salivating on cable shows. Still, their calm rattled her timing. For all her bravado, the tempo faltered, the rhythm off-beat. Cameras panned, capturing contrasts as stark as night and day. One woman visibly straining for dominance, and two others unbothered, quietly storing. Her words like ammunition for the moment of truth. The reaction in the room was its own drama. Some members shuffled in their seats, uncomfortable at the escalation, as murmurs curled up the rafters. Staffers darted eyes nervously to phones. Aides in the back corner whispered into earpieces, aware that social media feeds were already boiling over. Hashtags forming, commentary firing. Outside the Capitol, neighborhoods, classrooms, break rooms, and households were tuning in, jaws tightening, waiting for the counterstrike. But the brilliance of AOC and Crockett in this moment wasn't in rushing to interrupt. It was restraint. Their silence acted like a mirror, casting every ounce of Boebert's venom back upon itself. The more she clawed for mockery, the more her desperation seeped out. She wanted fireworks, but what she produced was a chaotic spark spraying wild in a room suddenly captured by her opponent's composure. The insults escalated, references twisted, stereotypes weaponized, insinuations meant to sting on a personal, generational level. Boebert's voice grew louder, her words quicker, like a performer losing the script under pressure. And yet, that was the moment when the tide truly turned. Because the louder she became, the darker the contrast. Against her onslaught, AOC and Crockett radiated a kind of serenity that doesn't just happen in politics. It comes only from people who've faced far heavier storms outside these walls. For some, that silence looked like defeat. But to others, millions watching online, it looked like strategy. A locked and loaded quiet before an eruption. Audiences flicked between live feeds, biting comments and meme accounts, all bracing for how, exactly, this calm would shatter. Boebert, however, mistook the silence as an invitation to keep digging. And dig she did, until the chamber responded not with laughs, not with applause, but with an uneasy awareness. She was spiraling in real time. And that's when fate quietly shifted. Everyone could feel it, that edge where escalation can no longer climb without collapsing under its own weight. The villain had spoken herself into exhaustion. The insults had revealed their true author, and now the protagonists, who had sat in restraint, who had carried calm like armor, were ready to do what heroes always do when arrogance mistakes quiet for surrender. The silence cracked into inevitability. The counterattack was coming. When it landed, when voices that carried dignity, history, and truth finally rose, it would not just humiliate a heckler. It would rewrite the story in a flash seen by the nation, heard on every screen, etched into political memory as the moment arrogance finally met its match. The chamber was tight with anticipation, every camera red light blinking, every reporter's pen hovering midair. Lauren Boebert had pushed, shoved, and goaded, expecting an eruption. But she hadn't expected the silence. And in that silence, something was born. Gravity. The kind of gravity that signals the room is about to shift, that mere seconds stand, between noise and revelation. Then Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez rose. The scraping of her chair across the floor was louder than any word spoken. Members turned, eyes locked. The murmurs quieted until the room was blanketed in the kind of hush that legends carve their space into. AOC didn't storm the mic, didn't lunge for the spotlight. She walked with measured calm, shoulders set, gaze unwavering. She knew the eyes of the nation weren't just watching, they were waiting. She let her first pause linger, a silence so controlled it felt almost theatrical. Boebert smirked, bouncing on her heels, waiting for a fiery outburst to fuel her narrative. Instead, AOC began softly. Her words were deliberate, paced, almost tender in contrast to the barrage of insults hurled just minutes earlier. "Congresswoman," she said, her tone level, "there comes a point when your words don't just reflect on you. They reflect on every person who believes in this country." The chamber stiffened. Every phrase hung in the air. She spoke of belonging, of identity, of what it means to stand in halls built by immigrants and defended by every kind of American. She spoke of her father's dreams, her mother's sacrifices, of families in the Bronx who clean buses, stock grocery shelves, and build futures stone by stone. Each sentence was weighted, not by anger, but by lived truth. And then the turn. With one pivot, she dissected Boebert's contradictions. Calm as a surgeon, she unveiled the hypocrisy, the family values, crusader embroiled in scandals, the champion of the working man who voted against their health care, the self-proclaimed patriot who mocked the very people America relies on every single day. The chamber wasn't hearing a politician, they were hearing receipts, and the more AOC unveiled them, the more restless Boebert became. The grin twitched. She fumbled with her papers. The bravado drained from her pose until only unease remained. Gasps rippled when AOC held up a sheet of public voting records. "You call us outsiders?" she said, her voice now ringing through the microphones like a bell. "Yet every vote you cast is against the very people who built this country, against women, against immigrants, against workers. The chamber erupted with murmurs, some struck by the blunt force of truth, others grinning at the blow landing squarely on target. And before Boebert could recover, Jasmine Crockett rose. Where? AOC's delivery was warm steel. Measured, deliberate, Crockett's was razor-sharp precision honed from years of litigating. Her cadence quickened, voice cutting clean lines through the chaos. "You speak about who belongs here. Congresswoman Boebert," she began, holding the room like a courtroom jury. "Let's talk about belonging. Because I earned my place here arguing day and night in courtrooms for people your policies ignore. I earned my place by defending families ripped apart by injustice. And those people you dismiss, they sent me here. They believe in me. So the real question is, who, exactly, believes in you when you tear them down?" The blow landed so hard the crowd audibly responded. Groans, gasps, a smattering of applause, quickly hushed by the presiding officer. Boebert shifted, rattled. She muttered rebuttals under her breath, but the spectacle of control had abandoned her completely. The audience could see it. The nation could feel it. Crockett pressed further, unsparing. She listed contradictions like charges, each one tightening the noose around Boebert's performance. "You say you stand for working people, yet you line up with corporations every time they come knocking. You talk family values, yet your scandals are front page. You call others outsiders, yet you sit here mocking immigrants who dream of nothing more radical than raising children in peace. That's not strength, that's cowardice, dressed up for cameras." Boom. The words ricocheted through the chamber. In one fell swoop, Crockett had transformed the insult into indictment. And then, the moment that turned confrontation into legend, silence. Both women stopped, deliberately leaving the words to hang in the air. Members shifted uneasily, as though breathing too loudly would break the spell. Even the cameras paused in a collective breath. Boebert stammered, half rising from her seat, half retreating back. The confidence that had powered her earlier attacks now visibly wilted under the weight of truth pronounced in stereo. Then came the mic drop. AOC leaned back in, her tone steady but sharp as the edge of a blade. "We don't need to shout to show strength. Our strength is living proof. Our strength is millions of Americans who are America, whether you choose to see them or not." And Crockett followed, closing the ledger with devastating timing. "We didn't come here to play your game. We came here to change it. And when history writes this night, it won't remember your insult. It will remember that you tried and failed to silence us." The chamber shook. Some members burst into applause before being gavelled down. The buzz was electric. On social media, live-stream clips hit timelines with captions like "exposed," "dragged live," and "the house belongs to all of us." Hashtags swirled, edits remixed the mic drop lines with cinematic soundtracks, and even seasoned commentators admitted this wasn't just a debate, it was a takedown written for the ages. Across the aisle, Boebert sat isolated in a storm of her own making. Every retort she attempted fell flat, spoken not into oxygen but into the suffocating silence of her deflation. Her bravado, once her weapon, had been neutralized with dignity and truth so sharp that the insult which began the drama now seemed almost laughably small. The counterattack had landed, not with fury, not with chaos, but with composure honed by years of being underestimated and power sharpened by the lives they represented. That night, AOC and Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend themselves. They defended the idea of belonging itself, resurrecting dignity in a chamber that had nearly drowned in jeers. And as the echoes of their words spilled through the marble columns out into the world, one truth crystallized across every news alert and every trending bar. The villains had their moment, but the heroes sealed their legacy. But what happened after? That was the real earthquake. Because when social media got hold of this confrontation, the nation itself would become the stage. and the aftershocks were only just beginning. The chamber may have returned to business, but outside those walls, the country was on fire. The clip of AOC and Jasmine Crockett's counterstrike hit the internet before the gavel even closed the evening session. On TikTok, teenagers stitched the moment into videos layered with booming bass drops. On Twitter, or what users still stubbornly called Twitter, hashtags shot up like fireworks. Dignity over disrespect, idiotic drop in the capital, and within minutes, simply AOC Crockett and AOC trending at #1 nationwide. The scene that began as an insult was now being etched in real time into digital history. Edits flew across screens. AOC's calm, "Our strength is living proof," spliced over cinematic film scores. Crockett's "That's not strength, that's cowardice," replayed with captions blinking in bold red fonts. Memers turned Boebert's fumbling expression into an endless loop, pairing it with captions like, "When the receipts show up to the meeting," and "Arrogance.exe has stopped working." The internet transformed the clash from political confrontation into cultural event, a lightning bolt discharged straight into the bloodstream of online discourse. And it didn't stop at memes. Within hours, influencers with millions of followers were reposting the clip. A Latina college student filmed herself in tears, saying, "For the first time, I saw someone like me stand there and win." A Black single mother, holding her child in frame, added on Facebook Live, "Jasmine Crockett told the truth I've been waiting to hear my whole life. That wasn't just defending themselves, they defended all of us." Television talk shows latched onto the moment. A commentator with decades of Beltway cynicism leaned forward during the nightly broadcast. "We've grown numb to shouting matches in Congress, but this, what AOC and Crockett did, this was different. They reframed the entire exchange, stripped it of spectacle, and gave it moral weight." Opposite him, a conservative pundit stumbled searching for words, forced to admit reluctantly, "They handled it effectively." Within 24 hours, late-night hosts wove entire opening monologues around the showdown. Jokes landed not at AOC or Crockett's expense, but squarely on Boebert's unraveling. One viral quip, "If mic drops were infrastructure, Congresswoman Boebert would have actually supported investment last night." The audience roared with laughter, but they weren't only laughing, they were choosing a side in the theater of politics. Celebrities joined the chorus. John Legend retweeted the clip with a simple line, "This is how you handle hate with truth." Ava DuVernay called it cinema. Kerry Washington praised Crockett's delivery as lawyer sharp and history shaping. Even politicians on the sidelines of the clash took the opportunity to weigh in. One senator tweeted, "In case anyone thought dignity doesn't land in, America anymore, watch this clip." But the most impactful layer wasn't mainstream. It was personal. In immigrant households across the country, kids pulled phones from kitchen counters to show their parents, "Mira, look, she said what we eat, feel." Families replayed AOC describing the Bronx, Crockett invoking justice. Their words carried into living rooms like affirmations. The most shared comment under one viral post summed it up. "For once, I didn't just watch politics, I felt seen." Boebert, meanwhile, tried to claw back narrative control, but every attempt backfired. She posted defiant clips to her own timeline, railing against radical socialists, but the replies drowned her out with meme after meme of her stunned expression, juxtaposed against AOC and Crockett towering in still frames. Her allies went on cable shows attempting spin, but the substance of their arguments got lost under footage replayed with millions of views. The villain had miscalculated. She had brought gasoline to a spark, and in doing so, ignited a firestorm that now consumed her carefully crafted brand of bravado. And this wasn't fleeting viral buzz. What made these aftershocks seismic was their reach. High school debate coaches pulled up the clip in classrooms telling students, "This is how you dismantle an argument. Composure over chaos." Activists framed it as a blueprint for resistance. Don't match arrogance with noise. Match it with truth. Community organizers layered the moment into calls for voter registration, framing the hero's calm triumph as a reminder, the system changes when we show up. In the ripple effect, something larger was stirring. This wasn't just about AOC or Crockett winning a battle in the chamber. It was about a cultural hunger to see dignity not just survive, but prevail. The clip radiated validation to immigrants whose voices are still questioned, to women of color whose power is still underestimated, to young progressives challenged daily by stereotypes of inexperience. Every view, every share, every hashtag carried the quiet message, "You belong, and when you stand tall, arrogance will crumble." The headlines the next day crystallized it all. Mic drop heard across America. Dignity defeats disdain. Cable networks cut openers with cinematic montages of the exchange. Students painted murals of AOC and Crockett, frozen mid-speech in towering poster board recreations. The story had passed the point of news. It was legend in the making. And yet, even as celebration surged, something deeper was building beneath the surface. Because when the dust settled, many began asking, what happens next? Yes, AOC and Crockett had landed the blow. Yes, memes had crowned them champions. But politics doesn't end in applause. It extends into policy, elections, visions of the future. This clash wasn't simply an ending. It was a turning of the page. The aftermath wasn't just shockwaves. It was foreshadowing. Something larger loomed on the horizon. The night had proven dignity could win the battle. But would it be enough to win the war still unfolding in America's soul? The Capitol's marble floors still echoed with the buzz of applause and astonishment when the next chapter began to reveal itself. What came after this moment of triumph would test not only the heroes who rose so fearlessly, but the nation itself, because the resonance of their words carried more than applause, it carried responsibility. And as dawn broke the next morning, America was left asking, how do we turn viral victory into lasting change? In the days that followed, as the hashtag slowed and the headlines shifted, the true meaning of that night began to crystallize. For AOC and Jasmine Crockett, the confrontation had never been about theater. It wasn't about who could score the grooviest meme or the sharpest clapback. It was about something much deeper, something America has wrestled with since its founding. Who gets to belong, and whose voices carry weight in shaping the nation's future? And in reframing the attack, they revealed a universal truth that could not be reduced to a trending topic. Dignity always outlives disdain. Cruelty might trend, yes. It might dominate a news cycle or light up a social feed. But dignity, the calm, grounded self-respect layered into every word, every pause, every refusal to shrink, that is what endures in memory. That was the lesson carved into marble that night. Hate exhausts itself, but dignity renews itself generation after generation. AOC reminded Americans of their roots, not with statistics or platitudes, but with story. She reframed the insult against her as something bigger, proof that immigrant stories are not intrusions into the American tale. They are the American tale. From Ellis Island to San Juan to the Bronx, this country has always been carried forward by hands that dared to create. A life here even when the doors were half shut. Belonging, her speech echoed, is not granted by the powerful. It is written into the very DNA of America. Jasmine Crockett turned the attack on her into a spotlight on service. She illuminated her public defense work, law career, and advocacy, reminding America that public service is not about the optics, it's about the sacrifice. Family values, she reframed, aren't defined by who shouts them loudest. They are defined by who sacrifices the most to protect them. With that, she lifted the insult to its highest rebuke. Heroism is found in service, not headlines. Together, they constructed a moral architecture that transcended politics. What began as a sneer about ancestry or identity was converted into a rallying cry about what it truly means to call oneself American. Not ancestry, but empathy. Not arrogance, but accountability. Not cruelty, but courage. And the lesson radiated. Across communities, groups began holding up the moment as a compass. Teachers in civics classrooms replayed their speeches, telling teenagers, "This is more than politics. This is character." Parents pointed to the clip as evidence to their children that you don't answer bullies with rage. You answer them with poise and presence. The resolution was not only that dignity triumphed, but that dignity had been modeled. Millions who have faced disrespect in their own lives, on the street, in classrooms, at workplaces, suddenly felt as though they were not alone. Watching AOC and Crockett refuse to crumble, they realized something profound. Arrogance can be survived, and even conquered, with calm truth. And so the universal truth solidified. The story of America will never be defined by the cruelty of the few, but by the resilience of the many. The nation has always struggled with voices trying to narrow its identity. Yet over and over, it is broadness, not narrowing, that saves it. America expands through those it once tried to exclude. Its strength is fueled not by purity of lineage, but by plurality of contribution. The night at the Capitol was just the latest chapter in that long, complicated, but beautiful tradition. The crescendo of that lesson lay not in the finality of a clapback, but in what it asked of the rest of us. To stand taller than the insults hurled at our communities. To remember that service defines us more than slander. To recognize that history always bends toward voices that include rather than divide. When the dust of hashtags and headlines finally settled, what endured was a conviction, whispered by millions and shouted by thousands. We belong here. And in that shared whisper-turned chorus was the true resolution. For when dignity rises against arrogance, it does more than silence an antagonist. It lights the way forward for all who choose courage over cruelty, truth over theater, and service over selfishness. That is what will be remembered from that night. Not the insult, not the chaos, but the choice made by two women to turn contempt into clarity, turning a bully's sneer into a nation's mirror. And in that mirror, America glimpsed its better self, resilient, diverse, and unshaken. And so, the night that began with an insult ended with a story that shook the Capitol to its core. AOC and Jasmine Crockett team up against Lauren Boebert. Capitol goes into chaos. Wasn't just a headline, it was a snapshot of history in motion. Arrogance stepped onto the stage certain it would dominate the night, but instead it was dignity, calm and unwavering, that scripted the ending. What was meant to belittle became a rallying cry. What was aimed at exclusion turned into affirmation that every American, immigrant, worker, dreamer, belongs in the story of this nation. That's the moral clarity we're left with. Hate is loud, but it's fragile. Dignity speaks softly, but stands forever. AOC and Crockett demonstrated that truth in real time, showing us all what it means to face contempt without flinching, to turn mockery into momentum, and to remind the country of who we truly are when we rise to our better selves. But here's the thing. This isn't just about two women holding their ground. It's about every one of us carrying that same steadiness into our own lives, whether in a classroom, in a workplace, at the ballot box, or in daily conversations. It's our dignity, our service, our courage that will continue to shape the America we know is possible. If this story struck something in you, if it lit a spark of pride, of resilience, of belonging, don't let it stop here. Share it. Amplify it. Subscribe and be part of building a movement where truth drowns out arrogance and where our voices, together, become impossible to silence. Because tonight, dignity won in the Capitol. Tomorrow, with all of us standing tall, dignity can win everywhere.